Welcome to Sherlock Midnight Echo, where every whisper hides a chilling mystery.
That, at least, was how its residents preferred it. Nestled among low, rolling hills and hedgerows trimmed with almost competitive neatness, Little Densham was the sort of English village where nothing ever happened, unless one counted the annual disputes over church flowers or the mild scandal when Mrs. Blenkinsop had been caught watering her roses during a hosepipe ban. Life moved at a gentle pace, marked by the ringing of church bells, the arrival of the post, and the predictable ebb and flow of polite gossip. Winter had settled in early that year, drawing a crisp white hush over the lanes. Snow lay thick on cottage roofs and hedges, softening the sharp edges of the world and lending the village an air of festive tranquility. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the windows of Little Densham glowed warmly against the early darkness. It was in this spirit, of warmth, goodwill, and neighbourly cheer, that Mrs. Constance Halloway had decided to host her much-anticipated winter party. Mrs. Halloway, a widow of ample means and firm opinions, lived at Halloway Grange, a rambling Georgian house just beyond the village green. She had been a fixture of village life for nearly 20 years, dispensing charity, criticism, and unsolicited advice in equal measure. Though some found her formidable, none could deny her generosity, or her talent for organizing events that ensured everyone felt either obliged or excluded, depending on her mood. This year's party was intended to be her crowning achievement. The drawing-room of Halloway Grange had been transformed into a scene of seasonal abundance. Evergreen garlands wound their way around door frames and banisters, candles flickered in polished silver holders, and a grand fire blazed merrily in the hearth. Tables groaned beneath the weight of mince pies, spiced cakes, delicate sandwiches, and a particularly impressive trifle that Mrs. Halloway had insisted on supervising personally. Villagers arrived in twos and threes, stamping snow from their boots and shedding scarves and gloves, their voices rising in cheerful greeting. Miss Jane Marple, small and neatly wrapped in a dove-grey wool coat, arrived precisely at 4 o'clock. She accepted Mrs. Halloway's greeting with gentle gratitude and immediately positioned herself near a small table beside the window, where she could observe without appearing to do so. Miss Marple had long perfected the art of being overlooked. Her faded blue eyes, however, missed very little. From her vantage point, she watched the guests gather. There was Dr. Leonard Pierce, the village physician, his genial smile not quite reaching his eyes as he accepted a glass of sherry. Mrs. Edna Fowler, sharp-nosed and sharper-tongued, hovered near the fireplace, already leaning toward anyone willing to listen. Captain Arthur Bell, retired and rigidly upright despite the years, stood stiffly near the mantel, hands clasped behind his back. And then there was Miss Violet Crane, pale and fashionable, who seemed to shrink slightly whenever Mrs. Halloway's gaze passed over her. Miss Marple noted these things as one might note the weather, quietly, without comment. Mrs. Halloway herself presided over the gathering like a general surveying her troops. Her voice rang clearly above the hum of conversation, her laughter sharp and well-timed. She appeared in excellent spirits, though Miss Marple thought, if pressed, that there was something a trifle strained about her enthusiasm. At 4:30, Mrs. Halloway raised her glass. "A toast," she announced briskly, commanding immediate attention. "To good neighbours, good health, and the enduring comfort of tradition. May Little Densham continue just as it always has." There were murmurs of approval, glasses clinked, and the fire crackled obligingly. No one noticed at first that Mrs. Halloway did not drink. Instead, she set her glass down beside her chair, one gloved hand resting briefly on the table as though steadying herself. A faint shadow crossed her face, so fleeting that it might easily have been mistaken for fatigue. Then she swayed. The chatter faltered. Mrs. Halloway gave a small, startled sound, as if attempting to speak but finding herself suddenly unable to do so. Her hand slipped from the table. She collapsed heavily onto the rug before the fireplace, her body striking the floor with a dull, final thud. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. Someone screamed. A chair scraped violently backward. Dr. Pierce was suddenly kneeling beside the fallen hostess. his practiced hands already searching for signs of life. Mrs. Fowler pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes wide with something that looked suspiciously like excitement. Miss Marple remained seated. She leaned forward slightly, her knitting forgotten in her lap, and watched with keen attention as Dr. Pierce straightened slowly, his face grave. "I'm afraid," he said, clearing his throat, "that Mrs. Halloway is dead." The word hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Outside, snow continued to fall, silent and indifferent. Miss Marple sighed very softly. Winter parties, she reflected, were so often meant to bring people together. But human nature being what it was, they had an unfortunate tendency to expose far more than goodwill. And murder, Miss Marple knew from long experience, rarely arrived without a long invitation. The silence that followed Dr. Pierce's pronouncement was not the reverent hush of shock, but the brittle stillness that precedes movement, like ice beginning to crack. Mrs. Fowler was the first to find her voice. "Dead?" she repeated too loudly, her eyes darting from the body on the rug to Dr. Pierce's face. "Surely not dead, Doctor. She was speaking only a moment ago." Dr. Pierce removed his spectacles and polished them with unnecessary care. "I am quite certain, Mrs. Fowler. There was no pulse, no response. It appears to have been very sudden." "Her heart, then," Captain Bell said at once, with the air of a man offering a sensible solution. She was no longer young, after all. Miss Violet Crane let out a thin, breathless laugh that sounded dangerously close to hysteria. "Constance had the constitution of an ox," she said. "She used to boast she'd never had a sick day in her life." Several heads turned toward her. Miss Crane flushed faintly and lowered her eyes, twisting her gloved hands together. Miss Marple noticed that she had not moved any closer to the body. Dr. Pierce stood and looked around the room. "If everyone would remain where they are for the moment—" "Oh, must we?" Mrs. Fowler interrupted. "It's dreadfully upsetting, you know. And someone ought to ring the police." "I'll do that," said Captain Bell briskly, already heading for the telephone in the hall. The party, if it could still be called that, had dissolved into uneasy clusters. Some guests edged closer, driven by curiosity. Others retreated toward the walls, as though death might be contagious. A few whispered urgently behind gloved hands. Miss Marple rose at last and moved quietly to a nearby chair, where she sat down again with a faint sigh. No one took particular notice of her, which suited her very well. From where she sat, she could see Mrs. Halloway clearly. The body lay awkwardly, one arm bent beneath her, the other outstretched toward the small side table. Her face, usually so brisk and commanding, looked oddly surprised, the mouth slightly open, the eyes half-lidded as though she had glimpsed something unexpected just before the end. Miss Marple's gaze shifted, not to the body itself, but to the glass of sherry on the table. It stood untouched. Dr. Pierce followed her line of sight and frowned slightly. He picked up the glass, sniffed it, then set it down again without comment. But his expression had changed, becoming more thoughtful, more cautious. "Doctor," Mrs. Fowler said eagerly, "you don't think—" "I think," Dr. Pierce replied carefully, "that it would be wise not to make assumptions." That, Miss Marple thought, was often a very good sign that assumptions were already being made. The police arrived with commendable speed, their car crunching over the snow in the drive. Sergeant Collins, a solid, practical man with a moustache that suggested patience worn thin by years of village peculiarities, took charge with quiet efficiency. He listened to Dr. Pierce's account, examined the scene, and asked that everyone remain until statements could be taken. There was a collective sigh, some of annoyance, some of relief. As coats were fetched and chairs drawn closer to the fire, the room settled into a tense waiting. It was then that the talking truly began. "I always said she overworked herself," murmured Mrs. Fowler to anyone within reach. "Always organizing, always meddling. No rest, that was her trouble." Captain Bell, arms folded, shook his head. "Still doesn't explain dropping dead mid-toast." Miss Crane spoke very softly to Dr. Pierce, her voice trembling. "Do you really think it was natural?" Dr. Pierce hesitated. "I think," he said slowly, "that I should prefer to wait for the post-mortem." That single word, post-mortem, sent a ripple through the room. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was watching something else entirely. She watched the way Mrs. Fowler's eyes brightened when the word police was mentioned, the way Captain Bell avoided looking at the body altogether, the way Miss Crane flinched whenever Mrs. Halloway's name was spoken aloud. Most of all, she watched the small, unconscious gestures, the tightening of fingers, the sudden swallowing, the barely perceptible steps backward. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was remarkably consistent. Sergeant Collins cleared his throat. "Now then, I'll need to ask a few questions. Nothing formal yet." "Of course," said Dr. Pierce. "Anything I can do to help?" The sergeant gestured toward the table. "That drink there, was it Mrs. Halloway's?" "Yes," Dr. Pierce said. "She poured it herself." Mrs. Fowler leaned forward eagerly. "But she didn't drink it, did she?" "We all saw that." "Indeed," said Sergeant Collins. "Which is interesting." A pause followed, long enough for several people to glance instinctively at one another. Miss Marple's eyes drifted instead to the tray near the sideboard, where empty cups and plates were stacked neatly. She noted with mild interest that one saucer bore the faint smear of something dark along its rim, tea, perhaps, or something else. "I don't like this at all," Miss Crane said suddenly, "being kept here, as though we'd done something." "No one is accusing anyone," Sergeant Collins said, though his tone was neutral rather than reassuring. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Accusations, she knew, rarely began with words. When Sergeant Collins finally turned to her, it was almost an afterthought. "And you, Miss Marple," she said gently. "Jane Marple, and you were here from the beginning?" "Yes, indeed. I arrived just on time. Mrs. Halloway was in excellent spirits. Did you notice anything unusual?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, as though considering. "Only that she seemed a little hurried," she said, "as if she were anxious to get something over with." Sergeant Collins made a note. "Thank you. It was nothing, really. A small, unimportant observation." But Miss Marple had earned long ago that small things, especially the ones everyone else dismissed, had a habit of growing larger with time. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside Halloway Grange, beneath the garlands and candlelight, little Densham's belief in its own harmlessness had quietly, irrevocably died, along with its hostess. The removal of Mrs. Halloway's body was carried out with quiet efficiency, though the scrape of the stretcher against the doorframe lingered unpleasantly in the minds of those who heard it. When the door finally closed behind the policeman, the drawing-room seemed abruptly altered, as though the fire burned too brightly for what had just occurred. Sergeant Collins conferred briefly with Dr. Pierce near the window, their voices low. At last he turned back to the assembled guests. "You're free to go for now," he said, "but I'll be speaking to each of you again. Tomorrow at the latest." There was an immediate rustle of relief, mixed with something else, unease, perhaps, or the uneasy awareness that relief itself might look suspicious. Coats were reclaimed. Polite murmurs replaced whispered speculation. One by one, the villagers departed into the falling snow, casting backward glances at Halloway Grange as though it might call them back. Miss Marple waited until nearly the last. She moved slowly, her joints protesting faintly, and paused beside the side table once more. The glass of sherry had been left where it stood, a pale amber liquid catching the light. No one had thought to remove it yet. Miss Marple frowned. Just a little. She had seen that look before, on the faces of women in St. Mary Mead when something they had carefully arranged did not unfold quite as intended. In the hall, Miss Violet Crane struggled with the clasp of her coat, her fingers shaking so badly that she dropped it twice. Miss Marple approached her with mild concern. "Cold evenings do make the hands unsteady," she said kindly. Miss Crane startled. "Oh, yes, of course." She forced a smile. "It's been a dreadful shock." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Mrs. Halloway did enjoy being at the center of things. It must feel very strange without her." Miss Crane swallowed. She had a way of making people feel obliged. "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly. "Obligation can be quite a burden." For a moment, Miss Crane looked as though she might say more. Then Sergeant Collins appeared in the doorway, and the opportunity passed. Miss Marple walked home through the snow, her thoughts moving at a gentle but persistent pace. By the following morning, Little Densham was humming. News travelled quickly in a village unused to genuine tragedy. Curtains twitched, voices dropped, and opinions bloomed with remarkable speed. By the time Miss Marple reached the village shop for her bread and eggs, Mrs. Fowler was already holding court. Of course it was her heart, she declared, though her eyes glittered with excitement. That's what sudden deaths usually are. Still, Sergeant Collins wouldn't be poking about if there wasn't something. Miss Marple selected her eggs with care. I've often found, she said mildly, that poking about can sometimes create more questions than answers. Mrs. Fowler sniffed. Well, I shouldn't be surprised if it was all that business with the charity accounts. Charity accounts? Miss Marple inquired gently. Mrs. Fowler leaned closer. Didn't you know? Mrs. Halloway managed half the village funds, always very secretive, and there was talk, only talk, mind you, that not everything quite added up. Miss Marple paid and took her change. Talk has a way of growing, she said. At the post office, Captain Bell was explaining to anyone who would listen that the police were wasting time and resources. No signs of a struggle, no enemies worth the name, perfectly straightforward. At the far end of the counter, Miss Crane stood silent, her face pale as she collected a parcel, and at 10 o'clock precisely, Sergeant Collins knocked on Miss Marple's door. He accepted a cup of tea and sat stiffly on the edge of the chair, notebook at the ready. I wanted to ask you a bit more about yesterday, he said. You mentioned Mrs. Halloway seemed hurried. Yes, Miss Marple said, as though she were anxious to finish something before it began. Finish what? Miss Marple smiled apologetically. That I couldn't say. Only that it reminded me of a woman I once knew, always determined to make an announcement before someone else could. Sergeant Collins frowned. Announcement? Just a thought, Miss Marple said gently. He hesitated. The post-mortem's been scheduled for this afternoon. If it turns out to be poisoning. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Poisoning does rather require intention, she murmured, and intention usually comes with expectation. Sergeant Collins looked up sharply. Expectation of what? Of being heard, said Miss Marple. Or prevented. When he left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her thoughts settling on small, disquieting details. The untouched glass, the smear on the saucer, the look on Miss Crane's face when Mrs. Halloway fell. By mid-afternoon, the telephone rang. Sergeant Collins's voice was clipped. Miss Marple, the post-mortem confirms it wasn't natural causes. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. I thought as much, she said. There was poison in her system, he continued. Fast-acting, tasteless according to the doctor. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to her teacup. Then, she said quietly, Mrs. Halloway did drink something after all. And somewhere in Little Densham, someone else was beginning to realize that what had seemed so carefully planned had not ended quite as neatly as int. Ended. The confirmation of poison altered the atmosphere of Little Densham with remarkable speed. What had been speculation hardened into fear. Doors were shut more firmly, conversations dropped into murmurs, and the friendly nods exchanged on the village green took on a new cautious quality. A natural death was unfortunate. A murder meant that one of their own had been capable of it. Miss Marple, however, found that very little had changed. Human nature, after all, behaved much the same under pressure, only more visibly. Sergeant Collins returned to Halloway Grange that afternoon, this time with purpose. The house felt curiously diminished without Mrs. Halloway's brisk presence. The fire burned low, the decorations now faintly absurd, like props from a play abandoned mid-performance. Dr. Pierce stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back. The poison would have taken effect quickly, he was saying. Minutes, at most, which narrows the window, Sergeant Collins replied. She must have ingested it shortly before collapsing. Miss Marple, seated quietly on a brocade chair, listened with interest. Ingested, she murmured. Such a clinical word. Sergeant Collins glanced at her. You're thinking of the tea? Yes, Miss Marple said, or something very like it. The sergeant sighed. "We've tested the sherry glass. Nothing there." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "Then it did what it was meant to do. Direct attention elsewhere." Dr. Pierce frowned. "You believe the poison wasn't in the sherry?" "I believe," Miss Marple replied gently, "that Mrs. Halloway did not drink it." She rose and crossed slowly to the sideboard. "May I?" Sergeant Collins nodded. Miss Marple lifted one of the cups from the tray, a china cup with a modest blue pattern around the rim. She turned it slightly, examining the faint stain along the edge. "Tea leaves," Dr. Pierce said. "Possibly Miss Marple." "Agreed. But tea leaves usually settle. This looks as though something was stirred hastily." Sergeant Collins scribbled a note. Mrs. Halloway was known to take tea before entertaining, he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Alone, usually. A private moment before facing others." Dr. Pierce's brow furrowed. "Then someone would have had to prepare it beforehand, or interrupt her," said Miss Marple. "Or persuade her." The implication hung in the air. Later that evening, Sergeant Collins began formal interviews. Captain Bell was indignant. "I was with Mrs. Fowler most of the afternoon. Ask her." Mrs. Fowler confirmed it readily, perhaps too readily. "Arthur never left my side. Miss Crane's interview was quieter. I helped Mrs. Halloway with the decorations earlier," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She asked me to fetch something from the kitchen. I did, and then I left." "What did you fetch?" Sergeant Collins asked. "Sugar," Miss Crane replied. "She takes it with her tea." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Did she already have her tea?" she asked. Miss Crane hesitated. "Yes, I think so." Dr. Pierce shifted his weight slightly. "And after that?" Sergeant Collins pressed. "She dismissed me," Miss Crane said quickly. "Said she wanted a moment to herself." Miss Marple noticed the faint tightening of her lips. The interviews continued, each yielding small, unremarkable details. Nothing conclusive. Nothing on the surface that suggested murder. But Miss Marple was growing more certain. It was not what people said that troubled her. It was what they avoided. That night she sat by her fire, her knitting resting idle in her lap. Mrs. Halloway, she reflected, had been a woman who enjoyed control. Control of her household, control of village affairs, control of people. Such women rarely died without leaving unfinished business behind, and someone, somewhere, had been very anxious to ensure that whatever Mrs. Halloway had intended to say that afternoon would never be heard. Miss Marple smiled faintly. The motive, she suspected, would prove far more revealing than the method. The next morning brought with it a brittle brightness, the sort of winter sun that illuminated everything without offering warmth. Miss Marple stood at her window for a moment, watching villagers cross the green with unusual purpose. No one lingered, no one stopped to chat. Little Densham was behaving as though movement itself might be incriminating. She put on her coat and set out. At Halloway Grange, Sergeant Collins was already there, his car parked askew in the drive. Inside, the house echoed faintly, stripped now of festive trimmings. A woman from the agency moved quietly about, dusting and straightening with professional detachment. Dr. Pierce and Captain Bell stood near the fireplace, speaking in low voices. When Miss Marple entered, both men fell silent. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. Captain Bell inclined his head. "Miss Marple?" Sergeant Collins emerged from the study, papers in hand. "I was hoping you'd come by," he said. "I've been going through Mrs. Halloway's correspondence." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "letters can be very revealing." "That's what I'm beginning to think," he replied. She'd been writing to several people in the village, requesting private conversations. Urgent ones. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. How very unlike her to be vague. She wasn't vague, Sergeant Collins said. She was specific, but not in writing. Just dates and times, most of them for yesterday afternoon. Captain Bell stiffened. "She asked to see me," he said. "Said it concerned something from years ago. I thought it was some foolish misunderstanding." "And did you see her?" Collins asked. "No," Bell replied shortly. "I decided it could wait." Miss Marple noted the way his jaw tightened. Miss Crane arrived shortly afterward, pale and drawn. She hovered near the door, as though uncertain whether to enter fully. Sergeant Collins looked up. "Miss Crane, Mrs. Halloway had written to you as well." "Yes," Miss Crane said. "She said she wanted to clear the air." "About what?" Miss Crane's hands clenched in her coat sleeves. "I don't know. She never said." Miss Marple spoke gently. "But you feared you did." Miss Crane's eyes flicked to her. For a moment something raw showed there. Fear, yes, but also resentment. She liked to remind people of their mistakes, Miss Crane said bitterly. Even ones they'd paid for. Dr. Pierce cleared his throat. Constance had a strong sense of morality, her own version of it, Miss Crane said softly. Sergeant Collins made a note. Mrs. Fowler was also on the list. At the mention of her name, Mrs. Fowler herself appeared, breathless and eager. "I came as soon as I heard," she said. "Terrible business. Terrible. She wanted to discuss the charity accounts with you," Collins said. Mrs. Fowler waved a hand. "Oh, she was always fussing about figures. I told her she worried too much." Miss Marple watched her carefully. Mrs. Fowler's eyes were bright, but her smile was brittle. "Sergeant," Miss Marple said, "may I ask, did Mrs. Halloway keep a diary?" Collins nodded. "Yes, it was found in the study. Locked, and the key missing." Miss Marple sighed softly. "How unfortunate." The room fell quiet. "Mrs. Halloway," Miss Marple continued, "was a woman who liked her truths acknowledged. She arranged her party not merely for celebration, but for audience." "You think she intended to confront someone publicly?" Sergeant Collins asked. "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that she intended to prevent something from being denied." Dr. Pierce looked troubled. "If she threatened to expose someone, then that person," Miss Marple finished, "would have had a very small window of time to act." Sergeant Collins closed his notebook slowly. "And the tea?" he said. "Only someone with access to the kitchen could have prepared it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Or someone who knew Mrs. Halloway's habits well enough to interrupt them." Miss Crane swallowed. Captain Bell looked away. Mrs. Fowler shifted her weight. Outside, the sun glinted on the snow, bright and unforgiving. Miss Marple felt the familiar tightening of certainty settle in her chest. The pieces were beginning to align, not neatly, not yet, but enough to show the shape of the truth. Someone in Little Densham had not merely wanted Mrs. Halloway silenced. They had wanted her silenced before she spoke. The diary became the village's unspoken obsession. Though no one admitted it outright, Miss Marple could sense it in the way conversations stalled when she entered a room, in the careful phrasing of questions that skirted too closely around what Mrs. Halloway might have written. A locked book with a missing key had a way of inflaming the imagination far more than any open confession. Sergeant Collins took the diary with him that afternoon, along with several papers from the study. The house was sealed for the time being, and Halloway Grange stood dark and silent, its windows like unblinking eyes over the snowbound lawn. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her thoughts occupied not by the diary itself, but by the people who feared it. That evening, Dr. Pierce called on her. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said, accepting the offered chair. "I thought it might be useful to talk. Talking is always useful," Miss Marple replied. "It tells us far more than silence." He smiled faintly. "You think, then, that Mrs. Halloway meant to expose something?" "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but exposure is rarely general. It is you. Allie very personal." Dr. Pierce hesitated. "She came to see me last week. Asked questions about symptoms, about poisons." Miss Marple's needles paused. "How interesting." "She said it was for a book she was reading," he went on. "But she wasn't a woman who read thrillers." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "She preferred real lives." Dr. Pierce lowered his voice. "She also asked whether certain substances could be administered without detection. In tea, for instance." Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "And what did you tell her?" "That many could," he said, "but I warned her of the danger of curiosity." "Warnings," Miss Marple said gently, "are often invitations to the reckless." When Dr. Pierce left, Miss Marple sat very still for a long while. Mrs. Halloway had known enough to ask the right questions, to arrange meetings, to lock away her thoughts. and someone had known that she knew. The following morning brought a new disturbance. Miss Crane did not appear at the post office, nor at the shop. By midday, whispers began to circulate. By 2 o'clock, Sergeant Collins was knocking on Miss Marple's door once more. "She's gone," he said without preamble. "Left her cottage early this morning, packed a small case." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "Running away," she murmured, "is rarely an act of innocence, but it is not always one of guilt. We've put out inquiries," Collins said, "but it complicates matters." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied, "it clarifies them." He frowned. "How so?" "Because," she said, "Miss Crane was afraid, but not of the police. She was afraid of what Mrs. Halloway intended to say." Collins leaned back. "You think the diary implicates her?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that it frightened her enough to leave, which means she believed the truth was already close at hand." That evening, as darkness fell early and lamps glowed behind drawn curtains, Captain Bell paid Miss Marple an unexpected visit. "I hear you've been helping the police," he said stiffly. "I merely observe," Miss Marple replied. "Observation is a habit." Bell's gaze flicked to the mantelpiece, then back to her. "Constance was not a kind woman." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "She was a righteous one. There is a difference." "She held things over people," Bell said. "Old mistakes, old weaknesses." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and she enjoyed the moment when denial became impossible." Bell's hands tightened. "You make her sound vindictive. I make her sound human," Miss Marple replied. A silence stretched between them. Finally, Bell spoke again. "If she intended to disgrace someone publicly, then that person," Miss Marple said softly, "would have had motive, opportunity, and a great deal to lose." Bell rose abruptly. "I won't be questioned like a criminal." Miss Marple looked up at him with mild surprise. "I haven't questioned you at all." He left without another word. Miss Marple sighed and returned to her knitting. The next move, she knew, would not come from the police. It would come from the murderer. People who acted out of fear rarely stopped once the first danger had passed. They watched, they waited, and when they believed themselves safe, they made mistakes. Somewhere in Little Densham, someone was very carefully deciding what to do next, and Miss Marple intended to be watching when they did. The mistake came sooner than Miss Marple had expected. It began, as such things often did, with an attempt at reassurance. The following afternoon, Mrs. Fowler announced, loudly, and to anyone who would listen at the village shop, that Sergeant Collins had told her there was nothing further to worry about. The police, she said, were merely tidying up loose ends. Miss Marple, selecting apples with care, noted the emphasis placed on nothing. Tea must be a relief," she said mildly. Mrs. Fowler laughed a little too sharply. "Oh, yes, especially with Miss Crane having run off." "That tells its own story, if you ask me." "Does it?" Miss Marple asked. "Or does it simply tell us she was frightened?" Mrs. Fowler's eyes narrowed. "Frightened people usually have a reason." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "though not always the reason others expect." That evening, Sergeant Collins called again, his expression more troubled than before. "We found the diary key," he said. Miss Marple set aside her knitting. "Where?" "In the lining of Mrs. Halloway's handbag. Sewn in." Miss Marple nodded slowly. She was a cautious woman. She would have wanted it close until she decided it was time not to be. "And the diary itself," Collins continued, "contains references to money discrepancies in the charity funds. Nothing conclusive yet, but enough to suggest Mrs. Fowler had been creative." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Creative accounting often flourishes under the cover of respectability." "There's more," Collins said. "Entries about Captain Bell, about something that happened years ago. An incident involving a young woman and a promise made, then broken." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "Miss Crane?" "Yes," Collins said. "Mrs. Halloway intended to confront him. She wrote that she would no longer allow silence to masquerade as honor." Miss Marple smiled faintly. She did have a fondness for dramatic phrasing. "And finally," Collins said, lowering his voice, "there's a note from the morning of the party. She wrote that she suspected someone knew about the diary." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Did she say who?" "No," Collins replied. only that she would be careful. She wasn't careful enough, Miss Marple said softly. The next day brought the second shock. Miss Crane was found, not dead, but ill, collapsed in a boarding house, several miles away, her condition serious but stable. The doctor reported symptoms strikingly similar to those that had preceded Mrs. Halloway's death, though in a far milder form. "Someone tried to poison her," Sergeant Collins said grimly. Miss Marple shook her head. "No, someone frightened her." "How can you be sure?" "Because," Miss Marple said, "if the intention had been to kill her, she would not have survived. This was a warning, an echo." Collins frowned. "An echo of what?" "Of the method," Miss Marple replied. "Tea again, I expect." "Yes," Collins said slowly. "How did you know?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Because repetition is a sign of confidence, or desperation." The village, now thoroughly alarmed, retreated further into itself. Doors were locked earlier. Visitors were eyed with suspicion. And in the midst of it all, Mrs. Fowler began to unravel. She spoke too often, laughed too loudly, volunteered information no one had asked for. When Miss Marple encountered her on the green, Mrs. Fowler seized her arm. "You don't think I had anything to do with it?" she said abruptly. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "My dear Mrs. Fowler, thinking is such a private activity. One shouldn't assume it's shared." Mrs. Fowler's grip tightened. "Constance was going to ruin me." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "She was, and now she can't." Miss Marple's eyes met hers steadily. "No," she said, "but her truth still can." Mrs. Fowler released her arm as though burned. That night, Miss Marple sat quietly by her fire, her thoughts moving with calm precision. The poison had not been intended for Miss Crane, not originally. Miss Crane had been a complication, not the cause. The real danger lay elsewhere. Someone had acted not once but twice, and the second act, Miss Marple knew, was never about necessity. It was about fear of being discovered, which meant the time had come for a little. E-test. Miss Marple never hurried a test. She found that people revealed far more when they believed events were unfolding naturally, when they thought themselves observers rather than participants. And so, over the next 2 days, she allowed little Densham to stew in its own anxiety, while she quietly set the stage. It began with a conversation that was meant to be overheard. Miss Marple chose the village shop at precisely 11 o'clock, when Mrs. Fowler was certain to be present, and Sergeant Collins occasionally dropped in for tobacco. She stood at the counter speaking to the shopkeeper in a voice just loud enough to carry, "Yes," she was saying mildly. Sergeant Collins mentioned that the diary was rather more detailed than expected. Dates, figures, even names. Poor Mrs. Halloway was very thorough. Mrs. Fowler's head snapped up. "And the poison," Miss Marple continued, so clever of the doctor to notice the similarity between the two cases. "Once you see a pattern, of course, everything becomes clearer." Sergeant Collins, who had entered quietly, paused near the door. Miss Marple caught his eye and gave the smallest of nods. Mrs. Fowler approached the counter, her smile fixed and unnatural. "You do like to gossip, Miss Marple." "Oh, I don't think this is gossip," Miss Marple replied serenely. "It's more closure." Mrs. Fowler laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Well, I'm sure it will all be sorted soon." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Very soon, I should think." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on Dr. Pierce. "I wanted to ask you," she said, settling herself comfortably, "about dosages." He looked startled. "Dosages?" "Yes. Mrs. Halloway died quickly, but Miss Crane did not, which suggests a deliberate calculation." Dr. Pierce frowned. "You believe the same person was responsible?" "I believe," Miss Marple said, "that only someone confident with measurements would die." Repeat the method." Dr. Pierce's expression darkened. "Someone accustomed to handling quantities, adjusting them." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, "and someone who would panic when repetition became necessary. That evening Sergeant Collins came to see her once more. "I've spoken to Mrs. Fowler," he said. "She insists she had nothing to do with the tea. Claims she never went near the kitchen." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Did you ask her about the sugar?" Collins frowned. The sugar? Yes. Miss Crane fetched it, you see, but Mrs. Halloway kept her sugar in a tin, not cubes. Someone would have had to measure it out. Collins went very still. And Mrs. Fowler is treasurer of 3 village committees, Miss Marple said gently. She measures things for a living. The next morning, Miss Marple made her final move. She asked Sergeant Collins to arrange a small gathering at Halloway Grange, ostensibly to clarify a few remaining points before the case was closed. Captain Bell was invited, Dr. Pierce attended, and Mrs. Fowler, of course, arrived promptly, dressed in her most respectable coat. Miss Marple sat quietly as the others spoke, allowing tension to coil tighter with every passing minute. At last she spoke. "It is such a pity," she said softly, "that Mrs. Halloway never managed to make her announcement." Mrs. Fowler stiffened. "Announcement?" "Yes," Miss Marple went on. She intended to explain how the charity funds had been altered, small amounts at first barely noticeable, then larger ones, always justified, always temporary. "That's absurd," Mrs. Fowler snapped. "There's no proof." "There is," Miss Marple said gently. "In the diary, and in the bank statement Sergeant Collins obtained this morning." Mrs. Fowler's breath quickened. "And then," Miss Marple continued, "there was Captain Bell, a promise broken long ago, a young woman left to suffer the consequence. Mrs. Halloway meant to speak of that as well. Captain Bell looked as though he had been struck, but neither of those things," Miss Marple said, "was enough to make someone kill." She turned her gaze fully on Mrs. Fowler. "What made the murder inevitable," she said quietly, "was the realization that Mrs. Halloway knew both truths, and that she intended to reveal them in one afternoon." Mrs. Fowler laughed weakly. "You're imagining things." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Then perhaps you will explain," she said, "why the poison used on Miss Crane was weaker." Mrs. Fowler's eyes flicked toward the door. "You had no reason to kill her," Miss Marple went on, "only to frighten her. Because you thought, quite wrongly, that she was the one Mrs. Halloway meant to accuse first." Sergeant Collins stepped forward. "Mrs. Fowler—" "She was going to ruin me," Mrs. Fowler burst out. "After all I'd done for this village." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, "and you couldn't allow her to speak." The room was very quiet. Mrs. Fowler's shoulders sagged. "I only meant to make her ill," she whispered, "just enough to stop her. But she took the tea too quickly." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. It was over now. Little Densham would return in time to its careful politeness and quiet judgments. The snow would melt, curtains would open again, but some truths, once uncovered, never quite settled back into place. As Sergeant Collins led Mrs. Fowler away, Miss Marple gathered her gloves. Winter parties, she reflected, were dangerous things. They warmed the hands, but they so often exposed what people had been hiding all along. With Mrs. Fowler safely in custody, the village seemed to exhale. Halloway Grange, though still marked by the shadow of tragedy, regained a fragile air of normality. The fire burned steadily in the hearth, the garlands remained in place, and the low hum of conver. Sation returned to the post office, the shop, and the church, though now tempered by the memory of recent events. Miss Marple moved through the village with her usual quiet attentiveness, observing subtle shifts in behavior. Captain Bell, for instance, now avoided eye contact, his customary stiffness replaced by a more nervous caution. Miss Crane had returned, recovering slowly from the scare, and spoke in soft, measured tones, her gratitude toward those who had watched over her palpable. Dr. Pierce, always conscientious, seemed preoccupied, as though replaying every moment of the party in search of lessons learned. Miss Marple herself returned to Halloway Grange one morning, drawn by the unspoken obligation of curiosity. The house felt emptier than usual without its mistress or the frantic energy of her guests. She wandered to the study, where the diary still rested in Sergeant Collins's safe hands, and reflected on the careful orchestration that had led to Mrs. Fowler undoing. There was a peculiar satisfaction in seeing the pieces fall into place, yet Miss Marple knew the human element could never truly be contained. While the immediate danger had passed, she considered the ripple effect of fear and secrecy that such a crime inevitably created. She noticed, with quiet observation, that the furniture had been rearranged slightly, as if by someone with lingering anxiety, perhaps Miss Crane herself subconsciously reclaiming the space. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple met Captain Bell at the churchyard. He stood by a gravestone, hands clasped behind his back, the winter sunlight casting long shadows across the ground. "I owe you a debt," he said, his voice subdued. "Your insight and your timing. Without it, I don't know what might have happened." Miss Marple regarded him with her usual gentle scrutiny. "Captain, you only needed a small reminder that actions have consequences. Mrs. Halloway would have spoken the truth, whether you were ready or not." He nodded, and for a long moment neither spoke. Around them the wind stirred the bare branches, scattering frost like tiny diamonds across the churchyard. By the time Miss Marple returned home, she had already begun to piece together a broader understanding of human nature in Little Densham. Some would forgive, some would forget. Others would remain haunted by the knowledge that appearances could be deceiving and that even the most careful arrangements, like Mrs. Halloway's winter party, could conceal peril beneath civility. That evening, knitting in hand, she reflected on the series of small actions that had led to such dramatic consequences: a misplaced key, a carefully prepared cup of tea, a hastily written note, and a single moment of panic. The village, she knew, would continue its measured rhythms, but the events of the past week had etched themselves into memory. Little Densham would never quite feel as safe or as predictable again. And in that quiet reflection, Miss Marple recognized, as always, that the human heart, capable of kindness, secrecy, fear, and courage, was the true mystery she sought to understand. For in unraveling the actions of others, she had once more glimpsed the delicate balance between intention and consequence that defined life in even the most seemingly peaceful village. In the days that followed, Little Densham began the slow process of settling back into routine, though an undercurrent of wariness lingered beneath the polite greetings and habitual exchanges. Shops opened at their usual hours, the post arrived on time, and the church bells rang as they always had, but the shadow of Mrs. Halloway's winter party remained, a reminder that tea civility often concealed more than it revealed. Miss Marple continued her quiet observations, visiting the shop, the post office, and the churchyard in her habitual circuit. She noticed the subtle shifts in behavior, the careful way villagers avoided discussing the diary too loudly, the way Captain Bell's stance had softened yet remained vigilant, and the almost imperceptible tension in Miss Crane's shoulders, a residue of the fear that had driven her from the village. One morning, Sergeant Collins called at her door. "Miss Marple, the statements have been reviewed and filed. Mrs. Fowler has been charged, and Miss Crane has returned home under supervision. The case is, for all practical purposes, closed." Miss Marple nodded, fingering her knitting. "The practical matters are indeed concluded, Sergeant, but the truths remain." "They always do." Collins hesitated. "You mean the diary?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "And the knowledge of what drives people, that is something the village carries with it, long after events appear to settle. Later that week, Miss Marple paid a visit to the remaining villagers who had been most closely involved. She spoke briefly with Captain Bell, now somewhat restored to his former composure, reminding him that promises, even long-broken ones, could never be entirely erased from memory. She called on Miss Crane as well, who expressed quiet gratitude for the intervention that had prevented greater harm, though her expression betrayed the lingering anxiety of someone who had glimpsed the consequences of human fear and desperation. In her own home that evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire, reflecting on the chain of events. The murder had been sudden, shocking, yet its origins were entirely human: ambition, fear, and a desire to control truth. Each subtle gesture, each minor deception, had culminated in tragedy. And yet, in the midst of it, the small village had revealed the breadth of character contained within its quiet lanes. She considered Mrs. Halloway's meticulous nature, her habit of arranging events to expose hidden truths, and the ease with which one person's anxiety could transform into criminal action. The winter party, intended to celebrate and bring together the villagers, had instead illuminated their vulnerabilities. Miss Marple sighed softly, a faint smile playing on her lips. She reached for her knitting, resuming the quiet rhythm that comforted her, knowing that while some mysteries concluded with arrests and statements, others, those of human behavior and motive, were never truly finished. In Little Densham, life would continue, polite and orderly, yet subtly altered. The village had glimpsed the depths of ambition and fear that lay beneath familiar faces, and that knowledge would linger, quietly, as enduring as the snow that had first blanketed the streets during that fateful winter party. And as she worked her needles, Miss Marple reflected once more on the delicate, inexorable interplay between intention and consequence, knowing that in even the most peaceful village, human nature would always provide its own inexhaustible mysteries. The first frost of January had settled over Little Densham when Miss Marple received a brief note slipped under her door, written in a familiar, elegant hand. It was from Miss Crane, thanking her once again for her intervention and expressing a desire to see her soon. Miss Marple smiled softly. There was a calmness in that note, a subtle acknowledgement that the worst had passed, but also a quiet plea for understanding, the sort of thing that only a woman like Miss Crane could convey without speaking aloud. When they met later that afternoon, Miss Crane was composed, yet her hands betrayed a residual tension, fingers twisting lightly around the edge of her gloves. "I cannot tell you how grateful I am," she said, her voice low, almost reverent. "I never realized how fragile our control over events could be." Miss Marple nodded, setting aside her knitting. "Control is always an illusion, my dear, especially when other people's motives intersect with our own." Miss Crane sighed. "And Mrs. Halloway, she was so formidable. Even now I cannot help but feel the weight of her absence. She revealed, through her methods, the weaknesses in all of us." "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "Her brilliance lay not in cruelty, but in her ability to expose truths that we preferred remain hidden. And it is a testament to human nature that some will react with fear, others with denial, and some, like Mrs. Fowler, with action that crosses the boundary into wrongdoing." They spoke at length, walking slowly through the crisp streets, observing the familiar patterns of the village, the way smoke curled from chimneys, the way dogs padded along snow-laden paths, and the careful nods exchanged between neighbors who had learned, in subtle ways, to tread more lightly. By the time Miss Crane departed, there was a sense of closure, tempered by reflection. Miss Marple remained behind, considering the chain of events that had begun with a winter party and ended with revelation, fear, and ultimately justice. She understood, as always, that the human heart was both predictable and endlessly surprising, that motives were layered, and that appearances were never to be trusted. That evening, sitting once more by her fire, she reviewed the final sequence of events in her mind. Mrs. Halloway's careful planning, the measured panic of the guilty, and the courage of those who had survived the ordeal, all of it fell into a pattern as clear as the winter sky. Each person had acted according to their nature, the fearful, the ambitious, the conscientious, and the observant. Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the subtle lessons Little Densham had provided. The village would continue, polite and orderly, yet the memory of that winter party would leave a quiet imprint, an awareness that civility often hid both ambition and desperation. And, as always, Miss Marple herself would continue to watch, to notice and to understand the delicate interplay of human behavior that so often determined the difference between safety and calamity. With a soft sigh, she returned to her knitting, each stitch a reminder of the rhythm and continuity of life, even in a village where the unexpected could arrive in the guise of a winter party, and reveal that the most ordinary of gatherings might conceal the extraordinary intricacies of the human heart. Winter was slowly giving way to the first hints of spring, though the air remained crisp and the mornings frosty. Little Densham had resumed its ordinary rhythms, but Miss Marple noticed that the village now carried a new, subtle awareness, an understanding that beneath familiar faces lay ambitions, resentments, and secrets that might, at any moment, surface. Halloway Grange had been restored to quiet order. The study was cleared, save for the diary, now securely locked in the safe with its key in Sergeant Collins's custody. Mrs. Fowler had been formally charged and was awaiting her court appearance, while Miss Crane, slowly regaining her confidence, ventured out cautiously, often accompanied by friends who had helped her feel safe. Miss Marple, as always, observed from her quiet vantage point. She walked the village paths each morning, exchanged brief pleasantries with shopkeepers, and noted with interest how people moved through their routines differently, more aware that even the smallest act might carry consequences beyond immediate perception. One afternoon she found herself at Holloway Grange once more. The house no longer felt oppressive. The sharp edges of fear had softened into memory. Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room, her fingers tracing the edge of the mantelpiece, thinking of Mrs. Halloway's meticulous nature and the way her actions had brought to light the hidden dynamics of the village. Sergeant Collins arrived with a folder of documents containing the last statements, bank records, and correspondence. "Everything is officially concluded now," he said. "There is nothing more to investigate." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "Yes, for the authorities, but human understanding is never so neatly concluded." She glanced around the room. "Mrs. Halloway's winter party may be over, but the lessons it taught remain. Each person acted according to their nature, revealing truths that polite conversation would have kept hidden for years." Collins nodded. "I suppose that's why you always observe rather than intervene." "Observation," Miss Marple said softly, "allows one to see what is easily overlooked. Even the smallest detail, the tilt of a cup, the hesitation of a hand, the look in an eye, can illuminate the truth far more than the loudest confession." By late afternoon, the village seemed to hold its breath once again, though there was a quiet reassurance now. People moved more carefully, but without fear. There was a subtle return of warmth in their greetings, tempered by the awareness that trust must be earned and maintained. Miss Marple returned home as the sun began to dip behind the hills, painting the snow with pale gold. She settled into her favorite chair by the fire, knitting in measured rhythm, her mind reviewing the chain of events. The winter party had begun as a simple celebration, escalated into tragedy, and concluded with revelation and justice. Yet the most enduring effect was not the fear or the crime itself, but the understanding of human nature it left behind. As the fire crackled and the last light faded from the sky, Miss Marple reflected on the intricacies of intention, fear, and courage. Little Densham would continue its days, polite and orderly, yet forever marked by the winter that had revealed so much. And she, quietly observing, would remain ready to notice, to understand, and, when necessary, to guide, for even in the most peaceful village, the human heart would always provide mysteries, waiting to be unraveled. And so the village settled, the snow softened by early spring sun, and Miss Marple, content in the knowledge that truth had been revealed and justice served, returned to the comforting rhythm of her knitting, her thoughts already anticipating the next small, revealing detail that life in Little Densham would inevitably provide. Spring had fully begun to take hold in Little Densham, though the mornings still carried a crispness that reminded villagers of winter's recent hold. The snow had receded into soft patches along the hedgerows, and crocuses and snowdrops pushed bravely through the soil, heralding new beginnings. Life in the village had resumed its familiar rhythm, yet a quiet vigilance lingered in subtle ways. People smiled, exchanged pleasantries, and tended to daily tasks, but their eyes sometimes betrayed a cautious awareness, a recognition that appearances were not always what they seemed. Miss Marple, as ever, moved through this changed landscape with her calm attentiveness. She visited the post office and the shop, stopping briefly to converse with neighbors who now approached their exchange. With a new delicacy. Conversations flowed politely, but under the surface, small details, an inflection in the voice, a careful pause, a slight shift in posture, spoke volumes to her observant eyes. One afternoon, she received a note from Captain Bell, asking if she would join him for tea at Holloway Grange. The house, now quiet and orderly, seemed less oppressive than in the weeks prior, its spaces no longer echoing with tension. When Miss Marple arrived, Captain Bell greeted her with a tentative warmth, the weight of recent events evident in his careful movements. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into an armchair, "I wanted to thank you again for your discretion and insight. The village is—" Returning to normal, I suppose, but one cannot help feeling the residue of what happened. Indeed, Miss Marple said, folding her hands neatly. Events of such intensity leave impressions that linger far longer than the immediate danger. People learn, whether consciously or unconsciously, to measure their words, their actions, and their trust. Captain Bell nodded. I feel I understand more about my own nature than I ever have, and of course, I see now how easily appearances can deceive. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Appearances are the cloak in which people hide their motives, Captain. Some do so innocently, others with intent that can be dangerous. Their conversation wandered to the village itself, how Miss Crane had returned to cautious confidence, how Mrs. Fowler awaited her trial, and how the villagers, in small ways, were adapting to the knowledge that even familiar faces could harbor secrets. Yet through it all, life continued. The church bell rang, the shopkeeper called greetings across the green, and the first warm breeze rustled the budding leaves. Later that evening, as Miss Marple returned to her own home, she reflected on the lessons imparted by the winter party that had so dramatically disrupted the village. The crime had been an act of fear and desperation, driven by the desire to conceal wrongdoing, yet it had also illuminated the depths of courage and the subtle workings of human conscience. Every interaction, every hesitation, every carefully measured gesture had contributed to the resolution. By the fire, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the soft rhythm grounding her as she thought over the intricacies she had observed. Little Densham had learned, in its own quiet way, that civility was a delicate facade, and that the human heart contained both shadows and light. The village, restored to order, yet subtly transformed, continued its days with the understanding that truth, no matter how long concealed, inevitably finds a way to emerge. And in that gentle reflection, Miss Marple felt the familiar satisfaction of comprehension, the knowledge that human behavior, in all its complexity, would always provide a mystery waiting to be understood, even in the most peaceful of villages. Spring had settled fully over Little Densham, transforming the village with a quiet, renewing energy. The snowdrops and early tulips brightened the hedgerows, and the soft hum of daily life had returned, though now tinged with a subtle, lingering awareness of what had transpired. The villagers moved about with polite smiles, their eyes, just occasionally, betrayed an understanding that appearances could be deceiving, and that even the most ordinary gatherings might conceal hidden depths of ambition, fear, or resentment. Holloway Grange, once the scene of drama and tragedy, had regained a serene order. The study, where Mrs. Holloway had meticulously documented her observations, remained locked in the safe, its secrets secure for the moment, while the household adapted to life without its formidable mistress. Miss Crane had recovered fully and resumed her gentle routines, carrying herself with a newfound quiet confidence. Captain Bell moved with careful deliberation, tempered by the lessons of recent events, and the villagers had settled back into their familiar rhythms, cautious but resilient. Miss Marple, as always, observed with her unassuming patience. She visited the shop, the post office, and the churchyard, her eyes noting the subtle shifts in posture and expression, the nuanced gestures that revealed more than words ever could. She saw the villagers' polite facades layered with the awareness of the truths they had glimpsed, the knowledge that civility could hide both vulnerability and duplicity, and that the smallest act could carry profound consequences. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting a soft golden glow across the village, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting calmly. Her thoughts lingered on the winter party, the tragedy it had concealed, and the chain of human actions, fear, ambition, loyalty, and courage, that had brought the truth to light. Justice had been served, but the deeper revelation remained, that human nature in all its complexity was the true puzzle, the perpetual mystery that even the most observant could never fully solve, only appreciate in its unfolding patterns. As the flames flickered and the last shadows of the day faded, Miss Marple smiled faintly. Little Densham had endured, tempered by the events of that winter, and life would continue with its quiet rituals, its polite greetings, and its unspoken secrets. The village had been tested, and in its endurance it had learned that truth, while sometimes delayed, was never entirely suppressed. And so, in the gentle rhythm of knitting needles and the steady warmth of the fire, Miss Marple reflected once more on the enduring lesson of human nature, that even in the most peaceful village, beneath the veneer of civility, the intricate patterns of ambition, fear, and conscience would continue to play out, always offering new mysteries for those patient enough to observe and wise enough to understand. The village slept under the soft embrace of early spring, serene yet forever changed, and Miss Marple, quietly watching over it, knew that the story of human hearts, its secrets, its follies, and its courage, would go on, as enduring and intricate as the patterns in her knitting. And with that, the tale of the winter party that ended in murder drew to its gentle, thoughtful close.